Hello everyone, Sam here, and today we're going to talk about The Dwellers in the Mirage. This story is by Abraham Merritt, probably better known as A. Merritt because that's how a lot of his stories seem to have been signed. And this was originally published in the pulp magazine Argosy in 1932 and was published from the January 23rd issue to the February 27th issue, with 6 parts, one each week. Because this was back in the time when Argosy published weekly, and you would get an entire novel done over several weeks as a serial. And this isn't something that's done as much today. Most people just publish their novels right out, but you did see it more often back then. So that's kind of an interesting element. And if you haven't heard of the Argosy, they were a very well-known, very popular pulp publication. So even if you haven't read an old issue of the Argosy, you've probably read something that was published in the Argosy because they were a hugely popular pulp magazine. And The Dwellers in the Mirage also came out in a book form later in 1932. So there have been plenty of editions of this story. But I wanted to talk about this edition because this edition was published by DMR Books. I think you can see their symbol here next to my finger. And DMR Books is a publisher that specializes in pulp and fantasy stories, particularly sword and sorcery. And one of the main reasons they published this one is that the DMR Books folks consider A. Merritt a forefather of sword and sorcery. They have an article on their website that talks about Merritt's influence on sword and sorcery. I'll link that in the description if you want to check that out. Now, if you've seen the title, you know that I chose this story for Haggard January. And you might be going, well, wait, what does H. Rider Haggard have to do with A. Merritt? And actually quite a bit, because A. Merritt was very much influenced by H. Rider Haggard. For a start, there's some obvious things. This story deals with a lost world, and, Haggard was really big into Lost Worlds, so there's some obvious influence there. And I have some positive proof from DMR Books themselves, because I believe it's Deuce Richardson, he did a blog on H. Rider Haggard, who he says was also a forefather to sword and sorcery, and he lists A. Merritt as someone who was heavily influenced by H. Rider Haggard's works. And reading this story, yeah, I can really tell that Merritt was influenced by Haggard. You have the obvious thing of a lost world, which Haggard obviously did a lot of stories in, but you also have some other things like the Mirage land being filled with a warrior race. That pops up a lot in Haggard's books about ancient warriors, and either in these lost lands or just some of his historical romances, he did a lot of warrior race stories. And you also have stuff like reincarnation, because reincarnation is a big theme in H. Rider Haggard's works. And it's a major element of this story, because the main character is a reincarnation of an old warrior. So Haggard did a lot of stories regarding that story element. So that's pretty obvious here. And of course, you also have the thing of Haggard did stories that dealt with powerful women ruling these societies. Obviously, she is the most well-known. And in this one, you have 2 women who rule the respective civilizations of the Mirage Land. One who's, a little more sort of nature girly and the other one who's a powerful warrior. So there's a huge amount of Haggard influence in this story. So this is a good choice for Haggard January. I also have to admit that I wanted to read this mostly because I've heard about A. Merritt a lot. I've heard tons of things about him in pulp circles, but I actually haven't read anything by him before, so this was a good chance to come in and read some of his work. But to describe the actual story, what's the actual story about? This story is about Leif Langdon, who is a polyglot. That basically means that he speaks multiple languages. He's had this ability to speak languages of multiple different civilizations very well. And he went to college for it. And he just has this natural ability to pick up different languages fairly easily. And he's going on a surveying expedition in Alaska with his old college friend, Jim Two Eagles. And Jim is a Cherokee. And they're both supposed to be surveying in Alaska, but it's pretty much meant to be a chance to catch up. Like, they haven't been together for a few years. It's a working vacation, essentially. But the vacation soon ends because they find this strange valley in the wilderness where there's these mountains around the valley, and due to some weird phenomena, the sun causes this mirage to go over the valley where people just think, oh, there's nothing in there. It's a bunch of rocks. It's nothing interesting. But if you look at it the right way, you learn, oh, no, there's actually a bunch of trees and water and a lot of, like, strange things that the mirage hides. So they go to investigate, and of course, since it's a Lost World story, they both fall into it. And when they're inside of the valley, they discover that there's two civilizations that are kind of in a cold war with each other. One half is the peaceful Rilya, I believe that's how you pronounce it, the Rilya, who are basically these little people who sort of live in the trees or live in these, like, little huts. They're kind of the prototypical peaceful fairy folk, and they're led by this dark-haired woman named Evely, who's kind of a jungle princess type. I guess forest princess might be more accurate. Very light-hearted and good-hearted too. And the other half of the valley is filled by the Aegir of the kingdom of Carrick. And they are led by Tibur, this warrior with a hammer, and Lur the witch woman, who is this flaming red-haired warrior woman with this posse of wolves. And these two and that civilization of Carrick worship the dark god Kalkuru. And so the Aegir and the Rila are kind of in this Cold War situation where this river separates them, and they've had wars long ago, and they've said, all right, nobody cross the river. Well, as long as no one crosses the river, hostilities won't pick up. But of course, when Jim and Leif pop in, that peace gets a little tenuous for various reasons. And the thing that makes things even worse, Leif is believed to be the reincarnation of Dwayanu. And Dwayanu was Kalkuru's greatest warrior in the ancient days. And even worse, Leif is starting to feel the ancient memories of Dwayanu reemerge within him. So it's just the perfect storm of bad circumstances, especially because Dwayanu wants to conquer in the name of Kalkuru. So it's a precarious situation, to say the least. So before I start the actual review of the story, I first wanted to review the edition of this book by DMR Books, because on Facebook I mentioned that I was going to do a review of this book, and DMR Books, whoever was running the Facebook account, said, "Oh yeah, that sounds real interesting." So I really wanted to review the actual edition of the book before I talked about the story itself. So the first thing I'll talk about is the front cover. The front cover is this. It's a little hard to see on my camera, but it's the character Leaf Langdon summoning Kalkuru to do a sacrifice of this woman. And this was illustrated by Robert Grafe, and this was on the January 23rd, 1932 issue of Argosy. It's a good choice for a cover because it's a very striking cover, and I think it communicates the idea of the story pretty well. The next thing was, there's this opening essay. I believe it's by Doug Ellis. Yes, it's by Doug Ellis. And it discusses the broad history of the story's creation, sort of talking about where Merritt was at in his writing career when he wrote this, and basically the backstory behind the changed ending to the story, because this story actually had different endings, and he sort of explains the background of that, and that's very informative. He also he also recommends a few essays and other stories that are tied to Dwellers of the Mirage. So it's a very good essay in that regard, of discussing the history of the story and how the different endings came about. And actually within the story, there's illustrations throughout the story, and these are the illustrations by Virgil Finlay. Virgil Finlay did the illustrations for this story, not in the original Argosy edition, but in the Fantastic Novels reprints in April 1941 and September 1949. Fantastic Novels was another pulp magazine, and they reprinted this story in those issues. And it's very neat stuff. It's, again, kind of hard to see on my camera, but this is one illustration of Finlay's. There's another where he has this great drawing of Kalkuru. Oh, yeah, here it is. There's some very cool thing, because Kalkuru's meant to represent, like, the Kraken. He's supposed to look like the Kraken, so Finlay's got a lot of great art in here. One weird thing I noticed is that some of the artwork, it's on one page, but then the next one is blank. And my suspicion is that's a thing to prevent the ink from bleeding through, because these are all black and white illustrations, so it's not missing pages. I think it's just a thing to prevent the ink from bleeding onto the words on the next page. And honestly, that's one of my only big issue regarding these illustrations in this book is that there's no point in either essay where they specifically say, oh yeah, all the illustrations you see throughout the main text are Virgil Finlay's illustrations. They never say, I was only able to figure it out by looking in the front, seeing, well, okay, Robert Grafe's illustration is on the front, Samuel Cahan's illustrations are in the back, Virgil Finlay's the only other one listed, so I'm guessing it's his. So that's my only real major criticism of this edition. I wish that Virgil Finlay's illustrations were more... There's more of a signal that, yes, these are his illustrations. And I just kind of wish somebody would have mentioned it more clearly in one of the essays. But other than that, fantastic illustrations. The other big draw of this edition is that it has the three different endings that Merritt wrote at particular times. The final version, the one that Merritt eventually decided on after several years after the story was done, that's the one that's in the main body of the text. It's the one that DMR Books uses to close the story out. And then the other two endings are sort of put right after that for people to read immediately after finishing the story. I'll talk more about the endings later, but that was a neat format, putting the endings right after. And then there's an ending essay by Deuce Richardson discussing how Dwellers in the Mirage influenced later sword and sorcery writers, particularly with the character Lur the Witch Woman, because she's this red-haired warrior woman. She has this huge pack of wolves, and he lists out all the various writers who were influenced by this character and other elements of Dwellers of the Mirage. So that actually was very helpful. It let me check out all the various stories that were influenced by this story, which I always like it when people say, when pulp publishers say, oh yeah, here's how this story influenced other writers. That's very helpful, and I like that. There's also this one interesting thing. There's this short letter written by A. Merritt that is included, and it's one where Merritt attests to the scientific accuracy of many elements of Dwellers in the Mirage, and he lists like several things that happen in the story that have been shown to be factually supported by then recent reports and magazines of the time. There's this one where he mentions, oh yeah, the Cherokees really did have a history with little people, because this one Cherokee party went to Florida and they saw little people, and it's like that's kind of interesting. Merritt seems to be fairly serious in this letter, so but I don't think he's like saying, oh yeah, I found a valley in Alaska that's hidden by a mirage. I think he's mostly trying to argue that some elements in the story are not 100% fantastical. They might have some basis in truth. I think that's what he's going for. Because even in the story, Leif Langdon like thinks through some of the elements of the Lost World in like scientific terms. So I think Merritt is sort of approaching it from that perspective. And the final thing this edition includes is the original pulp drawings for the Argosy by Samuel Cahan. And this was the original illustrations Cahan did for Argosy when Dwellers was published in Argosy. So that's pretty neat. Yeah, the illustrations are much more simpler than Virgil Finlay's. I'm guessing because 30s pulp illustrations were still pretty simplistic at the time. I'm guessing by the 40s they'd figured out how to do more detailed illustrations in the pulp magazines. So I'm going to get to the actual review now of the story. In regards to the actual edition from DMR Books, I would say that this is actually a really good edition of the story. It has a lot of good additions to information in the essays. It's got a lot of great artwork. I would definitely say, even if you maybe have another edition of this book, you should probably get this one, because there's a lot of great information and supplementary material in this. So to get to the actual review of the story, I kind of want to start a little differently than I do, because Normally I start off saying what I really like about the story, and then I move on to saying the stuff I don't like about the story. But I'm going to actually reverse it this time because there's sort of a weird thing with this story where I like the second half of this story more than I like the first half. It's just a weird thing where most of the problems I have with the story kind of happen in the first half, but then the second half is just real slam bang good stuff. So I'm going to talk about the stuff I don't care for first. Like I said, I have some issues with the first half of the story. Because a lot of the first half of this story is kind of sluggish in places, because there's a lot of characters who are kind of talking amongst each other and sort of explaining the concepts that the story is examining. And it takes up a lot of word count, and there's not much in the way of actual action throughout this first half. It's pretty sedate, and a lot of it's talking. And some people have told me that's kind of a common occurrence in a lot of Lost World stories because they require setup for the Lost World concept to work, and sometimes the Lost World writers will sometimes get carried away and start talking about the idea of the Lost World and the strange things in it so much to the point that you're almost doing more setup than story. So I kind of got that vibe in this first in the first half of this story. The one that really stood out to me is that there's this really long flashback scene in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. Because Leif Langdon, before he goes to Alaska, he tells Jim about this experience he had working as a translator in Mongolia. And this is where he first encounters one of the cults of Kalkuru. And it just seems to go on a little longer than I thought was necessary. It just really explains and explains everything. Every action is described. It goes on, and something about it just seemed like it took a little too long. And the problem is, it's a very necessary part of the story. You do need that setup to explain, like, Leif Langdon's mindset when he's in Alaska, and just to sort of explain the idea of Kalkuru. So it's one of those things that I'm not really sure how to fix it, because you really do need that segment of the story, but it just seems to take a little too long, in my opinion. What else? Well, I kind of already said this, but there's not really any action. We don't get much in the way of action scenes in this first half. Because, again, Merritt seems to be going more for, like, a talkative and thoughtful vibe, which is nice, but it does eventually kind of turn into, well, okay, is this just going to be talking? So that first half, there's just not much action, and it kind of gets a little dull in places. Probably the biggest problem I have with the story is Evely. The character Evely, who's the basically the leader of the little people, and she's just not that interesting of a character. You know, she's just sort of the generic, good-hearted, loving princess of nature, and I've seen this character done a lot of times, and she just does not really stand out. She's just like, oh, a good-hearted character. And she's meant to contrast with the more sinister Lur the Lur the Witch Woman. But the problem is that Lur the Witch Woman is a much more interesting character. And Evely just kind of fades into the background. Like, even in the time, there's a period of time where Leif is separated from her, and then she comes back. And I was kind of like, oh, right, Evely was in this story. It's like she's just not that interesting a character, and because there's meant to be kind of a tear in Leif between Evely and Lur the Witch Woman, but when one of those characters is not all that interesting, it's like I'm not sure the tension works as well. So Evilly is probably the weakest character of the story, and yeah, I was not a big fan of her as she was executed. So those are the things I don't like about the story. But now I want to talk about what I do, and most of it happens in that second half of the story, because the second half really takes off once the kingdom of Carrick comes into play, when Leaf finds himself in the kingdom of Carrick with Lur the Witch Woman. Once that starts, the story really picks up. The pacing is much better in this second half. There's a good mixture of suspense, action, character development. Just everything sort of picks up once Lur the Witch Woman shows up, and it's like, whoa. I guess the first thing that I really enjoyed about this story is that there are a lot of weird elements in the story, and I mean weird as in weird fiction. These creepy, somewhat unknowable things that happen, and a lot of these elements are not really fully explained. Like there's in the river that separates between the two kingdoms, there are these giant leeches that the reason no one crosses the river is because the leeches will immediately grab you and suck all of your blood out. And Lur the Witch Woman lives in this castle that is surrounded by the Lake of Ghosts, where like all these seeming phantasms are in the lake, and it has like this strange menagerie of colors. And there's also a part where Leaf and Jim come across like flesh-eating vines, like vines that slowly encircle you and eat you. But a lot of these things are not really explained, or at least not explained in depth. But that actually works, because the whole point of this valley is that it's very uncomfortable and unnerving. So when you're able to insert all these weird things and give them a distinct enough of a threat and personality, it's very effective, and you don't really need it to be explained. And sometimes lack of explanation makes things more interesting, because you kind of wonder, well, how did this stuff come about? So I really like that. I also really enjoyed that the story takes place in Alaska, because Alaska is a really interesting setting for a story, and this was also when Alaska was not a state yet. It was just an American territory, and that kind of works as a neat way of getting Jim and Leaf out into the wilderness, because, you know, Alaska's a big place, and even in the 30s, there were probably still surveying groups. So it's a good excuse to find a desolate place that the story can take place in. And I also just really like the idea of the contrast between the frozen Alaskan wasteland compared to this warm valley where there's like just a perpetual springtime. And it's like, okay, that's a good contrast for a Lost World story. Probably the thing I really enjoyed the most was Jim and Leaf's relationship, because, like I said, they have this very deep bond because they went together to school and college. And like I said, Jim is a Cherokee, and one of the reasons he's friends with Leaf is that Leaf was able to speak to him in his Cherokee language, because he was able to pick it up after Jim taught him it. So they have a very deep friendship, and they have a good interplay with each other. And actually, it's their relationship that probably provides the most important plot development, because there's a plot development about 3/4 the way through the book that is based entirely on their relationship. And it's very impactful because we got to see how Jim and Leaf connected with each other. And I really like that Jim is not really a stereotypical Native American of the time. You know, he speaks perfect English. He went to He speaks perfect English. He's not dropping a bunch of weird Native American stereotype phrases. You know, he speaks brief things of Cherokee. So he's very interesting in that respect. I really liked his inclusion. I would say the only downside about Jim is that he and Leaf are not together for a large part of the second half of this story, and that kind of makes it a little bit of a bummer, because it's like they had such a great relationship that cutting them off from each other makes it kills a little bit of the vibe. But fortunately, Lure the Witch Woman shows up and picks up the slack, so it doesn't become a drag when Leaf is separated from Jim. And speaking of Lure the Witch Woman, she is definitely the standout character, because she is this warrior woman who, with flaming red hair, she has this entire retinue of Amazon soldiers following her. She has this whole pack of wolves at her command. And she uses like both her warrior prowess and magic, which is something I haven't seen a lot. I haven't seen a lot of sword and sorcery type characters who are both warriors and wizards. That's something that sword and sorcery doesn't seem to do. But Lure uses both magic and martial prowess, which I thought was a very cool trait. And I also love that she has sort of this conflicting thing where she both loves Dwayanu, but she also kind of wants to rule the world through her own strength. You know, she's in with the cult of Kalkru, but there's this like glimmer of self-interest in her. She kind of wants to conquer the world, more for herself and Dwayanu or Dwayanu than necessarily Kalkuru. So she has a very interesting character trait in that respect. And both she and Dwayanu have this great chemistry because they're both lovers, but they kind of want to dominate the other. They kind of want to prove that they're a little better than the other. And it kind of leads to this interesting play where, like, yes, they're lovers, but they kind of want to up each other. So that's kind of an interesting character element. And I just said Dwayanu, so I kind of gave away. This is a slight spoiler. I say slight because pretty much every single summary of the story brings this up. It's even mentioned on the back of this edition. But Dwayanu starts to emerge from Leaf at a certain point in the story and starts to take over his body. But this is actually really interesting because both Leaf and Dwayanu kind of have this interplay with each other where they can sort of remember stuff the other has experienced, but not quite. And their personalities are very different. And there's this really great scene towards the ending where one of them has to pretend to be the other, while everyone else around them thinks they're who they thought they were. So it's personalities in the same body trying to be the other personality, and that's a really fun element of the story where one has to pretend to be the other. I mentioned the character Tabur, and Tabur is a fun character because he's this braggart with this really big hammer, and he has a rivalry with Leaf / Dwayanu, and there's this constant push and pull where Tabur does not like Dwayanu. And he really wants it to be proven that Leaf is not the reincarnation of Dwayanu because Tabur just doesn't like him. It's just that thing of it's the classic rival, the classic rival archetype. Just someone who doesn't like you and will do everything to embarrass or even in some cases destroy you. So he's a fun character. I said in that my biggest criticism of the first half was that there wasn't a lot of action. The second half very much picks up the slack in that regard, because there's great action scenes where the characters storm a walled city and they get into this big battle within the ramparts. The final battle is in one of the temples of Kalkularu. It's a big fighting affair, and they're a lot of fun when they pop up. Well, the other thing I haven't talked about is Kalkularu himself, because I really like Kalkularu as he's presented here, because he's this dark god who resembles the Kraken. Like I said, he's on the cover. He's this guy here. He resembles the Kraken. And he's this dark god who is not just a god of death, but he's a god of non-existence. He doesn't just want to kill. He wants to wipe everything clean. Like, existence is disgusting to him. He wants to make sure nothing exists but the darkness of space and Kalkularu himself. Excuse me. So that's a really neat idea for a malevolent god. And he's also really the main source of horror in this story, because there's a couple scenes where the Kalkularu cult does a summoning ceremony, and Kalkularu comes out and he devours the sacrifices. You go, oh, are they like virgin sacrifices? No, they're pregnant women, because the whole idea is that Kalkularu hates existence. So a woman who is bringing another life into the world is an obscenity to him. So pregnant women are sacrificed to Kalkularu. And it's a really uncomfortable scene, but it works very good at the horror of these of this being. And it really just works at sort of setting effective stakes for the story, because the whole thing they're worried about, even cult members of Kalkularu, there are certain ways that if Kalkularu is summoned, he could come and devour all of the earth with ease. So there are these good stakes in the story where you want the heroes to succeed, because all of existence ends if Kalkularu is summoned properly. So again, it's a very effective stake in the story. So you do understand why it's important that Kalkularu stay in his far-off domain. I really enjoyed that. I'm now going to start the spoiler section, because I wanted to talk about the endings that are displayed in this edition. So I've got a table of contents in the description. The time that this spoiler section ends will be there. If you don't want to see the spoilers to the endings, please click there. And you can skip this if you still want to read the story. I do recommend this story. I'll say it right now. But I do recommend this story. So click to the spoiler end marking in the description table of contents if you don't want to hear this part. So to talk about the 3 different endings, there are the endings that I'm going to give certain names. The first is Merritt's original manuscript ending. This was the ending that he submitted to Argosy for the original story. The second ending is the Argosy revised ending. This was the ending that the Argosy editors wanted Merritt to change for reasons that we'll get into. And the third is Merritt's final ending, which was an ending that Merritt wrote several years later. I believe the essay says in the late 30s or possibly 1940. Basically doing a revision of that ending, and it's considered the final official ending because it's what Merritt really wanted the story to end with. So that's the manuscript ending, the Argosy ending, and the final ending. That's what I'll be referring to them as in this section. So in this edition, the final ending is the one that is incorporated into the text. And the manuscript ending and the Argosy ending are in their own sections after the main body of the story. The manuscript ending and the final ending both have the same essential ending, which is both Lur and Evilly dying, with Leaf leaving the valley back to the outside world. And they both have this very tragic air to them. The Argosy ending is different because it shows Lur dying, but Evilly survives. And it ends with both Evilly and Leaf leaving for the outside world together. And it's a more hopeful ending, but it still has sort of a bittersweet tinge because Leaf acknowledges that Evilly has to get used to the outside world, and Leaf is still kind of distraught by everything that happened to him in the valley. So it's a happier ending, but it's still got a bit of a bittersweet tinge. I would say that out of all the three endings, the one I prefer the most is Merritt's final ending. The one that he wrote several years after the story was done, and the one that is in the main body of the text of this edition. And I think it's the best because it feels the most cohesive. It feels like it captures the ideas of the story fairly well. And it basically ties into the whole tragic undercurrent of the story that some things are inescapable. You know, Leaf cannot escape Dwyanu's influence because due to magic and science, Dwyanu is going to live in him forever. So things that are not necessarily the best situations are inescapable. And that final ending really ties into the idea that, yeah, there's some things you can't escape, even if you can physically escape the valley. There's some things in your mind you're not going to be able to escape. And the whole point of Leaf Langdon is that he has never fit in anywhere in society. That's kind of his thing. He, even as he was growing up as a family, in his own family, he was kind of the outcast. So it ties into that tragic idea that Leaf is destined to forever be alone and always sort of internally conflicted. So I think it works the best in that respect. And regarding Merritt's manuscript ending, even though it's pretty similar and mostly the same, it does feel a little underwritten. Like, it feels like the story just wraps up a little too quickly as Merritt originally wrote it. And it just kind of feels like it was trying to get the story out the door. Like, all right, everything's done, move along. And honestly, that might be one of the reasons Argosy wanted it changed, because as it was written, it did feel like really weirdly abrupt. The parts were mostly there, but something about it, the pacing just doesn't feel right. And regarding the Argosy editorial dictated ending, excuse me, I think it's a little too sunny of an ending. Like, all these bad things happen to Leaf, but he still gets Evilly, and, you know, they go out to an uncertain future together. It's like, it just feels a little too sunny for the the whole tone this book has had. And Merritt isn't even really able to commit to the idea that, oh, Leaf and Evely will at least have each other, because the story still ends with Leaf kind of pining for Lur. I don't know if that was entirely intentional by Merritt, but it still kind of ends with him going, oh, you know, he laments about Lur. And I'm like, what? So you take Evely with you to live your life together, but you're still pining after this other woman? It's like, yeah, that part just doesn't mesh very well. And like I said in the beginning, one of my biggest problems with the story is Evely herself. I just don't find her that interesting a character. So you know, the Argosy ending's probably the weakest ending. Not god awful, but just like the final ending that Merritt did years later, and the one that's in this main text, I think it's the best one. So another reason this edition is very good. So, in regards to a final ranking for the story, in regards to edition, as I said, this is a 5 out of 5 edition. I would recommend, if anybody wants to read Dwellers in the Mirage, you should definitely get the DMR Books edition. It has a lot of neat supplementary materials, and is very well put together. So, 5 out of 5 for the edition of the story. In regards to the story itself, how I would rank it, going by the 5-star ranking, 0 being the worst, 5 being the best, I would give this a solid 4 out of 5 stars, which is a solid, good story. It's got a fantastic cast of characters. It's got a really neat Lost World environment, and it's just a very well put together story in general. I really liked my time with it. The only thing that's keeping it from a 5 out of 5 for me is just that opening half that gets a little sluggish in parts, and Evely's bland characterization. Those are the only two things that really keep me from going, oh yeah, this is a 5 out of 5 for me. But I still enjoyed it immensely. I really liked this story. And I would definitely recommend this to any sword and sorcery fan, or really any fantasy fan, because this just has all the right ingredients, and I think most people would enjoy reading this. So, yeah, 4 out of 5 from me. Definitely recommend you read it at least once. Excuse me. In regards to any inspiration, I like to talk about stories after I've read them, because I'm a working writer. I like to talk about if a story has inspired me in any way. And this absolutely has, because Lur, the witch woman, is an absolutely fantastic character, and I definitely want to use a Lur-type character in a fantasy story in the future. And according to Dose Richardson's essay at the end of this edition, I'm not alone in that, because apparently a lot of other authors from the pulp era used Lur as an inspiration, like Robert E. Howard, C.L. Moore, Leigh Brackett. Just a lot of people took inspiration from Lur, so I feel happy that I'm not alone in really liking her as a character. The other inspiration I got is that I kind of like the idea of doing a story regarding that experience that Merritt writes in the letter at the end of this story, where Merritt talks about how there was a scientific article that talked about how the Cherokee encountered little people in Florida. Is a native Floridian resident. I would really like to see what that story was about, and see if that inspires anything of my own writing. So a lot of inspiration coming from this story and its supplementary materials. So I'll definitely be reading the stories Dose Richardson mentions in his essays by Howard and Moore and Brackett, because they list a lot of them and they sound really interesting. So I'll be sure to check them out. So yeah, that's all I have to say about this. I say all, but I'm looking at the timer. We've gone to 50 minutes, so I had a lot to say about this, and a lot of it was good. DMR Books hit it out of the park with this edition. I heavily recommend this for any Merritt fans, Sword and Sorcery fans, or just plain old fantasy fans. This is a great story, and this is a great edition of the book. So go to DMR Books website, get this edition. You should probably get a couple more because they have a couple of really cool stories and collections of both new and old pulp. So check this out, get it ASAP, and thank you to DMR Books for providing such a great edition of a great story. That's all. Bye.